Welcome back, friends. We are in the week 5. We have already done American Transcendentalism this week and who were the great writers. I hope you remember. We have talked about Emerson, Thoreau, the great American Romanticism, and we have also touched upon the works of the dark romantics like Edgar Allan Poe, but that was a different context. Now, today we are going to look at what made and what are the formative influence, what were the formative influences on the early American literature, particularly the novel. We will be doing other genres also soon, including poetry and drama. We will be also doing plenty of exercises as we have been doing so far. And many of you have already started sending mails that you are enjoying and benefiting from that. So, I am glad that the exercises are proving beneficial. Today we are going to continue with American literature. That is what we are going to do in the next few classes. I will start with Declaration of Independence and the manifesto and what it meant, what it stand for, how that the Declaration of Independence inform, how did that ultimately inform the great American writings, and particularly with reference to Herman Melville and Nathaniel Hawthorne. Hawthorne, if you may recall, also belongs to the great tradition of Transcendentalism. He was a contemporary of Emerson and Thoreau, also Margaret Fuller. So, we were talking about the Transcendentalists, the American Romantics. Now, coming to the Declaration of Independence, what is it? One of the most important documents anywhere in the history, but particularly in the history of the United States. America was a colony. It was ruled by Great Britain. There were 13 American colonies and they all officially declared independence from British rule. People in the colonies, as expected, were unhappy. They did not have a say in the government. They had to pay heavy taxes. You remember we had talked about Boston Tea Party, no taxation without representation. There was also the dreadful Stamp Act of 1765, which where the British government collected taxes on paper goods like legal documents, newspapers, and also playing cards. In one act of protest, men dumped the cargo of a ship full of British tea into Boston Harbor, and in 1773 famously called the Boston Tea Party. In 1775 the colonists went to war with Great Britain. The war between the colonies and Great Britain was called the American Revolution or American Revolutionary War. That took place between 1775 and 1783. So, it was an 8 years war. Fenimore Cooper has written his series of novels, particularly The Last of the Mohicans. We will be talking about such great early American works as well, which which portrays the action during the, of course, it is a romantic version, but during the American Revolution. Like in all great, or as in all great documents, the Declaration too is firmly situated in a specific historical context. We have to remember that it was a product of its time, almost 80 or 90 years before the Civil War. Remember that. So, slavery, the dreadful practice of slavery was still on. So, we have to remember those things. So, the document itself was a product of its time in a situated in a specific historical, cultural, political context. The rhetoric of universal human rights, okay, and I am using the word rhetoric, okay, it was a good rhetoric, it was a good line, it was a good slogan. The universal human rights, it occupies only 20% of the document. Over 60% of it is a detailed list of grievances which the American colonists felt against King George III and the British government. So, you should remember these names. King George III, who was the king when the American Declaration of Independence was drafted. And what were the features? Now, today we know a lot about pursuit of happiness, equality for all. These are partly true, mostly rhetorical, but 60% the document consisted of grievances. It also discusses rather, because it's still in practice, human rights and the nature of national governance, sovereignty. Of course, specific complaints which the American colonists had against the actions of the British government is also there is a precise list of it. Those of you who are interested in seeing that, you can read the entire Declaration of Independence in textbooks, in encyclopedia, or in legal documents. However, the gist is the charter, or the document rather, declares the 13 British colonies on the east coast of North America independent on 4th July 1776. And remember, Thomas Jefferson, who was at the forefront of all, this is what he had to say. And this is an interesting passage. I have taken the entire passage right from the internet for you, for your benefit. Please take a look at it. This may be asked in exams, and perhaps you may be asked the author of this document. So, please take a look at it. And this is what Thomas Jefferson has to say about the people, the black people in America. The circumstance of superior beauty is thought worthy of attention in the propagation of our horses, dogs, and other domestic animals. Why not in that of man? Besides those of color, figure, and hair, there are other physical distinctions proving a difference of race. They have less hair on the face and body. They secrete less by the kidneys and more by the glands of the skin, which gives them a very strong and disagreeable odor. We are talking about a race. I advance it therefore as a suspicion only that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind. This unfortunate difference of color and perhaps of faculty, now this is again important, of faculty, is a powerful obstacle to the emancipation of these people. I don't want to make any comment here, any interpretation here. The other day we were talking about close reading of the text, new criticism. Okay, just take a look at the sentences, at the words, and derive your own conclusions. Next, so from here we will talk about one of the greatest ever authors, novelists, Herman Melville, who lived between 1819 to 1891. Most of us know him as the author of the great Moby Dick, the immortal classic, for which there are no sufficient words to describe the magnitude, the scope, and also the wonderful way the author has written the book, the language. Now, coming to Melville's early life, this is something that we have to do, though it may not be perhaps too relevant for many of you, but the point is, the fact is, there are some questions that are of late sort of examining your knowledge of biography and lives and of the writers, and not just their works. So, this is important to know. Now, Melville had a permanently weakened eyesight. He attended Albany Classical School in 1835. In 1839, he shipped out as cabin boy on the merchant ship called St. Lawrence. Now, all these details may not be very relevant, but you can never tell. So, St. Lawrence merchant ship, and the school he attended, Albany Classical School, so early life. In 1841, he sailed on the whaler, that is ship, Acushnet, and the name of the ship was Acushnet, to the South Seas. Now, in June 1848, the Acushnet anchored in French Polynesia. Now, if you read his nautical novels, he is primarily known as the writer of the sea. So, if you read all these novels, you will find so much references to people who live on distant islands and their way of life and their culture. So, he is not writing about the white collared white Americans all the time. Remember that. His scope, his people, his characters are derived from the offshores, from a different way, from the sea and the seaside. So, that is a different kind of a novelist. Now, his adventures in French Polynesia, whatever he felt, experienced, they became the subject of his first novel, Typee, which was 1846. Remember the dates, please. And then there was a sort of mutiny or uprising that landed the mutineers in a Tahitian jail, from which he escaped, and following this he roved through the island. So, a highly adventurous life, a very colorful life. He felt the bitterness of the colonials and the missionary and the debasement of the natives, what these people are doing to them. He was inspired by the sorry state of the Polynesians. His second novel was Omu in 1847, where he details the plight of these people, and also Mardi, which came in 1849, Polynesian romance. Same year he wrote Redburn, which is based on his first sailing or voyage to England. He also wrote White Jacket, okay, which sort of mixes his experience in the Navy and also the sharp protest against its brutality. And it's from here onwards that we start finding strong allegorical implications. Now, I'm not too sure whether Typee and Omu and Mardi and Redburn or White Jacket, they are important enough to be asked for exams, that too exams that test your admission to universities and fellowships and all that. So, I am not too sure how important are those. I am just giving you some kind of an introduction. As I have been saying all through, the most important work is Moby Dick. You can be asked any passage. It's a voluminous novel. We will be doing parts from there. I will be testing or giving you exercises based on that. And then of course there is Billy Budd the Sailor, the novella. So, in my view, those are the two most important works of Melville, but you can never tell. So, please be alert to that. Melville also soon moved to Massachusetts, where he became a friend of Hawthorne and started working on his magnum opus, Moby Dick. Of course, I say Billy Budd and Moby Dick, but then there is another great work. It's called Piazza Tales, which he wrote in 1857, Piazza Tales, Piazza, contain some of the finest short story fiction, and I will be talking about the kind of fiction that is there in Piazza Tales, but I strongly recommend, and there is a possibility that questions may be asked from Piazza Tales, also published in 1857. Remember the date. Something happened in India of enormous importance, and Piazza Tale, I mean, it's just sort of developing your associative memory. In 1866, he received a government job and began 10 years of service as a custom official in New York. And then he wrote a philosophical work called Clare in 1876. At his death, he left the unpublished manuscript of Billy Budd, which was eventually published in 1924. His other important works are books of poems, John Marr and other sailors, and Timoleon in 1899. I'm not too sure, you may check whether it's 1891. I think it's 1891, not 1899. Now, how to identify the Melvillian style? Adventures at sea, countries and cultures, extraordinary events, strong allegory, imagery in poetic language. Okay? Stories are rich in symbolism and they are difficult to understand. That goes without saying. We have done what is an allegory, and you know, and when you read Melville, you will understand allegory is a perfect vehicle for the kind of the writer Melville was. His preoccupation with the conflict between appearance and reality is something that could have been expressed only allegorically. He was interested in diverse things. You read Moby Dick and the way he digresses is astounding. But you should know that his experiences and adventures were also astounding. He never wrote about one place or one kinds of people. Diversity, variety of humankind. In Bartleby the Scrivener, one of his most famous stories from Piazza Tales. He combines pathos and humor to create a fable where, which is now read as a definitive text of existentialism. And then he also wrote a short story called Poor Man's Pudding and Rich Man's Crumbs. They are companion pieces that reflect on the contradictions of human behavior and ambivalence. Today he is recognized as the greatest of American literature. However, remember, in his own lifetime, he was a victim of misunderstanding. Tippy and Omu, they reflected a sympathy with pagan tribes, and that went beyond the romantic concept of noble savage, and therefore critics believe that he is portraying a contempt for Western attitudes and practices. Moby Dick, remember, was also not well received because of its too many meanderings and digressions. And then there was another book called Pierre, and it was reviled for its psychological tones. Billy Budd was one of his most famous and well-known work, and it's also accessible. You can read through it, and you can, although it's again very dense, packed with historical, cultural references. Try reading Billy Budd the Sailor. I can very well give you a one-liner of it. I can give you a story in one line, but try reading it and you will be searching for where the story is. So, there are so many psychological and moral and cultural, social digressions that you have to really look for it. So, Herman Melville, a difficult writer to go through, therefore a favorite of examiners. Billy Budd, remember, is a masterpiece set in 1797, depicts the tension of this period following the mutinies in the English fleet during the war with France. It's a novella with metaphysical implications. There are three central characters that acquire a symbolical significance. I won't be talking about that in detail, but soon when we do our exercises, we will be referring to this and other great works of Melville. It's a tale of treachery, betrayal, pathos, tragedy, and several things. And of course, Moby Dick at the center of the American canon. It's a canonical work. Melville was the first great novelist to write adventures about it's an enduring romance and an enduring adventure about the South Seas. Billy Budd too, like all his novels, is a nautical work, story of a young sailor where the boy, the young man, the titular hero, he is on board the merchant ship Rights of Man, and that's the name of the ship, very symbolical. rights of man. And then he is forced into service on the warship Bellipotent, that is all powerful in war. And the rest of the plot that I am not going to give you away today, it follows the narrative of Billy-Bird and Captain Edward Fairfax Verve, John Claggart and the Densker. So, these are the main characters. Today it is regarded as a true classic. Piazza Tales has a number of stories. Bartleby the Scrivener is the most well known, but also there is a tale called the Piazza, Benito Sereno, the Lightning Rod Man, the Encantadas and the Bell Tower. Look at the slide here, and here is short film, a filmic representation of Bartleby the Scrivener. Here is the YouTube link. Please do watch the adaptation. Okay, so from here we move on to another great writer, Nathaniel Hawthorne, who was born in 1804 in Salem, Massachusetts, New England. Entire New England culture, and Nathaniel Hawthorne was born there. His paternal ancestors had been prominent since the founding generation, but they spelled their name interestingly with Hathorn. Hawthorne inserted a W in his name, and I will later tell you why. When he began writing fiction, Hawthorne was drawn into a search for material in the careers of his early ancestors and the history of colonial New England. While attending Bowdoin College, Hawthorne began writing his major works, and again this is important for your exam purpose: Young Goodman Brown, Twice Told Tales, Ethan Brand, of course the Scarlet Letter, The House of the Seven Gables and the Blithedale Romance. The Scarlet Letter was published in 1850. So, what is the theme? Guilt, actual or imagined, and he feels the guilt is a universal human experience, and all his characters suffer due to some sort of guilt. Hawthorne's writings influenced Melville, and you have to remember that Melville dedicated Moby Dick, which was published in 1851, to Hawthorne. Hawthorne lived in New England, and as we have been talking about, he also he came into contact with the greats like Emerson and Thoreau. At one point, he also lived in that specific location, Concord. You should know these names. He died in 1864 and was buried in somewhere in a place called Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord, Massachusetts. The Scarlet Letter, as I have already told you, published in 1850, is his magnum opus, set in 17th century Puritan Massachusetts, and centers around the suffering, the guilt, the travails of someone called Hester Prynne, who gives birth to a daughter, Pearl, after an adulterous affair. So, Pearl is a result of this affair. Now, Hawthorne interestingly devotes very little time between Hester and his the man she has an affair with. Her husband is away fighting the Indians, the Native Americans. So, the novel is less concerned with the affair itself. It is more interested in the effects of the affair, and the theme is guilt and public shaming, and that is what Hawthorne was interested in, the taboos of Puritan New England in contemporary society. Hester Prynne famously had to wear the letter A, signifying adulteress. Okay, it's written in an embroidered form, the letter A, red embroidery, and she is supposed to put it on her on her clothes, on the dress she wears. Now, this novel became very popular upon publication, and this may be of interest to you. It was one of the, or rather, it was America's first mass produced book. Before the Scarlet Letter, books in America usually were handmade, sold one by one in small numbers. Hawthorne's novel benefited from a machine press, and its first run of 2,500 copies sold out immediately. As a result, the novel benefited one, controversial subject, also large available readership. We will be talking a lot about the Scarlet Letter, and before I wind up today's class, please take a look at this slide, Young Goodman Brown, and a very nice version of the story, an adaptation available on the YouTube. Do look at it. Thank you very much.